Okay, so we've got a really interesting listener question this week, and it's something I think we all grapple with a little bit. It's about these terms, nervous breakdown and mental breakdown. Like, what do they actually mean?
Yeah, they get thrown around a lot, kind of like using the same word for, a drizzle and a
I'm
hurricane.
like that.
Both involve rain, but the impact is totally different.
Exactly. And knowing the difference is super important when we're talking about mental health. So where do we even start with this one?
Well, the first thing to know is that neither nervous breakdown nor mental breakdown are actual medical terms.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they're more like common ways to describe experiences of intense stress and emotional distress. It's not like, going to the doctor and getting diagnosed with a nervous breakdown.
So it's more like saying my stomach hurts, but not knowing if it's indigestion or something more serious.
Exactly. And just like with our physical health, figuring out what's going on with our mental health requires a closer look.
Okay, so let's start with nervous breakdown then. What's actually going on when someone says they're having one?
Think of it like hitting your emotional breaking point, like that moment when the pressure of stress just becomes so overwhelming that it starts to, affect your ability to function normally.
Okay, so like when you have a million deadlines, your inbox is exploding, and you just want to crawl into bed and hide.
Exactly. Except imagine that feeling amplified like tenfold. And it's important to remember that everyone experiences stress differently, right? So what might push one person to that breaking point might not even phase another. We all have different, what do you call it, thresholds.
Stress thresholds, yeah.
Right, stress thresholds.
So what are some common triggers then that might lead to this kind of overwhelming stress, this breaking point?
Well, major life changes are a big one, even positive ones like getting married or starting a new job.
It's like your brain can only handle so much new at once.
Right. And then there are the more challenging life events, the death of a loved one, relationship problems, job loss.
Yeah, those are the biggies for sure. But our research also mentions things like moving to a new city, financial strain, even just the constant pressure of social media.
Absolutely. It's not always about the single event itself, but the cumulative effect of multiple stressors, like a glass of water. You can handle a few drops at a time, but
Like if
eventually.
overflows.
Exactly.
And when that overflow happens, when someone hits that breaking point, what does it actually look like? What kind of symptoms might they experience during a nervous breakdown?
Well, it can manifest in a lot of different ways. There's no one-size-fits-all experience, but some common signs are feeling constantly on edge, having trouble sleeping, withdrawing from social activities.
It sounds incredibly draining, both physically and emotionally.
It absolutely can be. You might also see changes in appetite, difficulty concentrating, even physical symptoms like headaches or digestive issues, like your body's way of saying, hey, we need to hit the pause button here.
Okay, so to clarify for our listener, a nervous breakdown is a term used to describe an intense, short-term reaction to overwhelming stress. It's often triggered by a specific event or a buildup of smaller stressors, and it can show up in a variety of emotional, behavioral, and even physical symptoms. But it's generally considered temporary.
Exactly. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about mental breakdown. While it shares some similarities with a nervous breakdown, it typically describes a more serious and prolonged mental health crisis. Think of it like this. Remember that overflowing glass of water we talked about? A nervous breakdown is like a sudden spill, messy for sure, but it's usually contained. A mental breakdown is more like a slow leak that eventually causes, a flood.
Okay, so instead of one specific trigger, it's more about the long-term impact of multiple stressors. Like they just kind of build up over time.
You got it. Imagine carrying a heavy backpack every single day. You might be able to manage for a while, but eventually that weight, it becomes too much. And that's kind of what happens during a mental breakdown. The cumulative effect of past traumas, unresolved emotional pain, all those ongoing stressors, it just becomes too much to bear.
That's a really powerful image. So what are some of the things that our research says contribute to this slow buildup of pressure, this slow leak?
Well, it's a combination of things, really. Our research highlights both psychological and biological factors. On the psychological side, past traumas, and we all have them to some degree, right?
Yeah.
Those can have a really long-lasting impact, even years later.
Like a wound that hasn't fully healed.
Exactly. And just like a physical wound, emotional wounds need care and attention in order to, heal properly.
It makes you think about how important it is to address those emotional wounds early on rather than just letting them fester.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why therapy, support groups, those kinds of things can be so valuable. They give you tools and strategies to help process those experiences in a healthy way.
So true. Okay, so we've talked about past traumas. What about those ongoing stressors? What role do they play in all of this?
Well, think of it this way. Those past traumas, they can create a kind of vulnerability, right? It's like they make us more susceptible to the effects of stress. So then when we encounter those ongoing stressors, relationship issues, work pressures, financial strain, you name it, they can feel even more overwhelming.
Because we're already starting from a deficit, almost like we're
Right.
starting with a nearly empty tank.
Exactly. And that's where those biological factors come into play as well. Our brain chemistry, genetics, even our physical health, these can all influence how resilient we are to stress and how prone we are to experiencing, these mental health challenges.
Wow, it's fascinating how interconnected everything is. Our minds, our bodies, our experiences. It's not just nature or nurture, but this complex interplay of both.
Exactly. And that's why taking a holistic approach to mental health is so important. It's about addressing those past traumas, managing those ongoing stressors, and taking care of our physical health as well. It's all connected.
It's like tending to a garden. You need to address the soil, provide adequate sunlight and water, and be mindful of any pests or diseases that might pop up.
What a great analogy. Now, I know what you might be wondering. You might be thinking, okay, but how do I know if I'm having a nervous breakdown versus a mental breakdown? How can I tell the difference? And it's a valid question, especially since neither term actually has a formal medical definition.
That's true. It's all getting clearer, but I can definitely see how it might be tough to pinpoint which one you're experiencing in the thick of it. So, what are the key things to look for?
Well, you're right. It's not always black and white. But generally speaking, a nervous breakdown is like a sudden storm. Intense, for sure, but relatively short-lived. Think days or weeks, not months or years. A mental breakdown, on the other hand, is more like that slow leak we talked about, with symptoms that are more persistent and debilitating.
So, with a mental breakdown, those symptoms might stick around for months or even longer.
Unfortunately, yes. And they can significantly impact your ability to function in daily life, your work, your relationships, even basic self-care. It's like the volume on everything gets turned up, and it just becomes so much harder to cope with even the smallest things.
And this is where seeking professional help becomes crucial, right?
Absolutely. While there are definitely things you can do on your own to manage stress and support your mental health, and we'll get into those in a bit, mental breakdowns often require professional intervention. It's not something you have to or even should go through alone.
Makes sense. It's like trying to fix a leaky faucet, right?
Right.
Sometimes you can tighten a few screws and solve the problem yourself, but other times you need to call a plumber to come in and really address the underlying issue.
Exactly. And there's absolutely no shame in asking for help. In fact, it's a sign of incredible strength and self-awareness to recognize when you need extra support.
So to recap for our listener, while both nervous breakdowns and mental breakdowns describe these intense reactions to stress, emotional distress, they differ in their duration, severity, and their overall impact on daily life. Nervous breakdowns are like those sudden storms, often triggered by a specific event. Mental breakdowns are more like those slow leaks that eventually cause a flood, often stemming from a combination of past traumas, ongoing stressors, and those biological vulnerabilities we talked about.
Well said. But remember, the most important takeaway here is that regardless of what you call it, if you're experiencing a significant decline in your mental well-being, it's crucial to reach out for support. Don't wait.
Because you're not alone, and there is help available. And that brings us to our next point. What does that help look like? What are some of the resources and treatment options available to someone who might be experiencing these challenges?
Well, let's dive into that.
Okay, so we've talked about these really intense experiences, these breakdowns, but what comes next? Like, what kind of help is out there for someone who might be going through something like this?
Well, thankfully, there are a lot of options, and sometimes the first step is the simplest one, talking to someone you trust.
Right, like a friend, a family member, a mentor, someone like that, someone who can just lend an ear and offer support.
Exactly. Just having that outlet, that safe space to share what you're going through can make a huge difference. It's like letting some of the air out of a pressure cooker.
Yeah, that release of pressure is so important. But sometimes we need a little bit more than just a listening ear, right?
Absolutely. And that's where professional help often comes in. Therapy, for instance, can be incredibly valuable.
And there's so many different approaches to therapy these days. It's not like a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Exactly. And one type that often comes up for people who are dealing with, intense stress and emotional overwhelm is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. What's the main idea behind CBT?
So CBT focuses on the connection between our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. Imagine this. You have a thought like, I can't handle this. That thought then leads to feeling anxious, overwhelmed, and then maybe you withdraw from activities that you used to enjoy. CBT helps you kind of identify those negative thought patterns and then develop healthier coping mechanisms.
So instead of thinking, I can't handle this, it might be more like, okay, this is tough, but I've gotten through tough things before and I can find ways to manage this?
Exactly. It's about reframing those thoughts and breaking those cycles of negativity.
That makes a lot of sense. And there are other therapy approaches too, right? It's not just CBT.
Oh, absolutely. Some people find that mindfulness-based practices are really helpful, especially for managing stress and anxiety. Others might benefit from psychodynamic therapy, which explores how past experiences influence our present-day emotions and behaviors.
It's really about finding the approach that resonates best for you, your individual needs and preferences and all that.
You got it. And then in some cases, medication might also be recommended as part of the treatment plan.
Like you're talking about things like anti-anxiety medications or antidepressants.
Exactly. Those types of medications can help alleviate some of the more debilitating symptoms, things like panic attacks or severe depression. And that can then create space for the individual to, engage more fully in therapy and other aspects of their recovery.
It's important to remember, though, that medication isn't like a quick fix, and it's always best to consult with a qualified healthcare professional to see if medication is right for you.
Absolutely. It's a decision that's best made in consultation with the doctor who can assess your individual needs and, of course, monitor your progress along the way.
For sure. And let's not forget about the power of support groups.
Oh, such a vital resource. Connecting with other people who've had similar experiences can be incredibly validating and empowering.
It's like that feeling of, I'm not alone in this, other people get it.
Precisely. Support groups can provide that safe and supportive environment to share your story, to learn from others, and to build a sense of community.
So for a listener who's maybe feeling a little overwhelmed, like where do I even start? What would you say is that first step?
Reach out to someone, talk to someone you trust, a friend, a family member, a therapist, your doctor. There are also some fantastic online resources like NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, the ADAA, and they offer information, support, and even connections to local resources.
It's a good reminder that even though these experiences, these nervous breakdowns and mental breakdowns, they can feel incredibly isolating, you are not alone. There is help available. There are people who get it.
Absolutely. And seeking help is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength. It takes real courage to acknowledge when you need support and to reach out for it.
That's such an important message. So if you're listening to this and anything we've talked about today resonates with you, please remember that you're not alone. There is hope. And taking that first step towards healing is an act of incredible strength and self-compassion.